All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, December 5th. And do we have any good news out there for Friday?
Do we have any good news? Okay, well, World War III has not started. Um, the Europeans have not seized the assets yet, nor have they sent troops into Ukraine. Um, over
Do
in
you think World
Asia,
War
yeah, go ahead.
Do you think World War III is a real possibility? We talk about this as such
Yeah,
a thing all the time, and when we have these conversations, I'll get to this point where I'm like, oh my God, this could actually happen, and then I go to bed, and then I wake up in the morning, I'm like, we're just talking crazy, right? Are we fear mongering? Like, is there really how
yeah.
real is this
I know
possibility?
it is real. I mean, um, yeah, the Ukraine war above all right now, that is a war in the heart of Europe. It's a proxy war. The Europeans and the Americans are deeply involved. You can say it's more than a proxy war. We've talked about this. Certain missile strikes are actually carried out by NATO against Russia. Um, so, yeah, the potential for this spiraling out of control is always there. And then, more than that, it's just the sense that, well, you can call it a Cold War has begun, that the various countries have lined up on different sides of an ideological front, and it's there's a sense that that this is a real this is, even if it remains cold, it's an existential battle. That's the way the Westerners, the collective West, looks at it. This is something that we're losing our grip. Basically, they don't quite use that language, but they have said, and that the rules-based international order, which is their pet project, it's the order that they have established and they were supposed to manage, that is coming apart. And for this, this is something that, again, they view as existential. And on the other side, we have the rise of the multipolar world, and they do see this as, especially the frontline states like Iran and Russia, it's existential for them. So this is at this time, it's a Cold War, and we have a proxy war in in Europe. We have tensions in East Asia. There's always a chance of a new war between Israel and Iran. So it's a Cold War that could always become hot. Now, I don't know if it'll ever really deserve to be called World War III, but it could. It is global, and it's this conflict. It's not a war yet, but this ideological clash that is already has military flashpoints. Um, it's global in nature. So there's always a chance that it really will become a world war. Now, maybe because there's always the specter of nuclear war, on the one hand, yeah, that makes it really scary. That it could, if it began, it could go nuclear. And we know what the consequences could be in that case. But that specter of nuclear war may prevent it from becoming, quite the all-encompassing world war that we might fear. It could be just sort of a series of proxy wars that goes on, and maybe later we'll call that World War III. Um, but I think we're right on the verge of something like that. It is. It's a Cold War, with that's hot on certain places of the front, and it could become a world war. Let me just say that.
But we've talked about this before, though, isn't just the fundamental weakness of NATO in the West that's going to prevent a real world war, because we just can't engage in it. Europe can't. I mean, the United States, it's going to be very difficult, very unpopular,
Yeah,
and against the whole world. I mean,
yeah,
it's
right.
basically like the weakness of NATO and the EU versus this delusional belief of moral superiority and military might that the West has, but we know it's delusional. So it just,
Yeah.
well, that should save us.
Yeah, well, that is something, that could be our salvation, right? Is the weakness of the West. And but we also have the insanity of the West. I've been reading recent comments by Chancellor Merz, and that guy seems to be very eager for war. I mean, it's crazy. He doesn't have the means, but there is this constant war talk, that we've discussed earlier in Europe in particular. But yeah, they talk. I don't think they're able to back it up. They're saying, maybe 5 years from now, you hear there are different timelines out there. But in 5 years, I doubt that they will be much stronger than they are. They've already had 4 years since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, and nothing much has changed, which really I find amazing. If you really consider this to be existential, why aren't you doing anything? Are you just incapable of doing anything? So maybe their lack of competence, their weakness, again, is what may save us. They just, in the end, just won't be able to go to war, even though they clearly, or at least some of the leadership, wants to go to war.
Right. And if you frame World War III, we say this larger battle between multipolarity and U.S. hegemony. In the West, the U.S. hegemonic side likes to use these terms like the international rules-based order or the international community. But in reality, the international community is 80% on BRICS side. When we talk about what the West as international community just consists of America and Western Europe, Japan, Korea, New Zealand and Canada, basically Australia too, right? That's it. It's a small collection, but the reality.
I wouldn't call it small, but it's a minority of the world's population and the world's territory. No question about it. Yeah.
Well, we should say small in the terms that those are the countries that don't produce a lot. Right. I mean, in that so-called Western international community, what Japan and Korea are probably the biggest sort of manufacturing places now, and the rest are just, and they're all in trouble. They're all in decline. They're all suffering. So it's just, the reality is here. The multipolar world is here, and we're just trying to resist it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. That's right. It is here, and I think its rise is inevitable, absent some sort of really crazy intervention or escalation. The multipolar world will prove victorious, because those are the trends. That's just the economic trends that can't be reversed. And I think also that this kind of, I guess I wouldn't even call it maybe ideological, but just the soft power that was so important to the West in the past has clearly, suffered greatly in the last few years, both thanks to Gaza and to Ukraine too. I mean, it's in tatters, and I think that that's something that really can't be undone. I think it's just that there's so much of the world looked at the West and saw something very ugly. It's something that they never seen before.
Right.
And
including
that's
the people in the West, I would like to say.
I think that's true. Right. So I think that, you just look at it, just see that the trends are all in favor of the multipolar world. But we see this is a dangerous time because, when an old hegemon is going down, it's obviously he can retire gracefully, right? And you could say, for example, the Dutch were sort of a hegemon. They weren't the supreme power, but they were a great power, and they declined gracefully. But I don't think you can say that, about the collective West now. The U.S. and Great Britain, they aren't declining gracefully. They are lashing out. You can say the Americans under Trump are in a very chaotic fashion, seem to be starting to recognize this on some level. Not entirely, because we're talking about the pivot to China or whatever. But at least in the case of Europe, there is some recognition. But among so many of the European governments, there is a obvious unwillingness to recognize this. And so we get some very, very dangerous incidents that could, lead to major escalations. And, just to talk about those tanker incidents in the Black Sea. And apparently there was one incident off the coast of West Africa too, attempts to attack ships that were trading with Russia. And there's a lot of suspicion that actually, in this case, I don't know if it's based on anything, but that the French were involved. And in past incidents like Operation Spiderweb, that the British were involved. Again, these are all, it shows just a lack of prudence, just to put it very mildly, on the part of these people. And I think, we're going to continue to see these kind of operations. In the end, they can't really reverse this tide that's coming in. You can say the Russian tide or the larger multipolar tide. But they are, they're intended as provocations, and they could, eventually, it may lead to some major response and an escalation spiral. That's, that's what happens again when you have a hegemon that won't really let go, and so they're trying to hold on in different ways. And so we are seeing some very bizarre and dangerous behavior.
But these provocations, aren't they accelerating the rise of the multipolar world? Because these people know who the bad guy is now, right? Essentially, that's what it is. Like, if we think about, I would say maybe let's go 10 years ago. I'm not sure. We were just saying how 20% of the world is part of the U.S. hegemonic camp, and now it's 80%. Seems to be behind BRICS, the majority, roughly so.
Yeah, a lot of them are neutral, but that's.
But if they're forced to choose, I think
they might
kind of know where they would go. Right. And so a lot of what Trump has done through his actions, through his tariffs, and then what Israel's been doing as well, all these have made countries choose. And so prior to this, I would have said, like, the majority of the world supports America. They is friendly with America. Yeah, there's maybe 20% of the countries have beef with them, something like this. But for the most part, everybody's happy. And this is what we were talking about, the destruction of the soft power. It's caused that reversal. Yeah. Now it seems like, whoa, now we're all alone. And the leaders that are in this remaining 20% of the world that are trying to protect U.S. hegemony, the collective West, they're becoming increasingly more unpopular, and they're doing more and more stupid, ridiculous actions that everybody is seeing, and just like makes them dislike them more and more. So the further they continue these provocations and try to protect this world order that they built, the more they are undermining it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair assessment. I think you put it well.
Okay, so then what moves you think that we will continue these provocations, even though that it will continue to make the rest of the world dislike the Western world until the point where we threaten the use of nuclear weapons or do something like this, which would just right. The nail in the coffin for Western hegemony then as well. It's just like, right. Okay, maybe you blow up the world, but you're going down with it. That's your only option out. The more that you try to attack what's already here, it's over.
Yeah, well, I think I don't see any sign that it's that they have abandoned their course. I'm talking about the leadership of the collective West. I think they're really very, very committed to this course, and so we'll continue to see these kind of acts. Yeah, it will do nothing to reverse, the course of, or to affect the outcome of the war, or even the outcome of the larger clash between the multipolar world and the collective West. The only chances, and maybe this is what motivates some of them, again, is that they provoke, leads to an escalation, and the escalation, actually leads to a hot war, a true World War III. And some of them actually seem to want that. It's quite extraordinary. But I get that sense about Chancellor Merz, for example, and he's the leader of the most powerful country within Europe.
What is the root of
but also, let me just add, the most recent poll shows that 75% of the German people disapprove of him, and only something like 22% approves. And this is in his first year in office, which is, generally you have higher approval ratings during your first year. So, see, that's the thing, is that all these people, even though they are on paper, they're very powerful, they don't have the arms and they don't have the popular support. And again, that, as you were pointing out earlier, might be our salvation.
Right. Well, what do you think is the core root of somebody like Merz that is driving him to want something like a global war? He should have knowledge of some of the facts of that, the fact that Germany would be utterly destroyed in a war with Russia. They don't have the troops, they don't have the manufacturing power. Their populations are already struggling economically as is, and you want to go to war. And like you said, they've had 4 years to gear up after all this hawkish talk, and they haven't done anything. We haven't seen anything come out of the collective West.
Right. Yeah, no, it's hard to explain. On rational terms, it's very, very hard to explain. It just doesn't make sense. We've talked about this inability, just let go of the whole supremacist way of thinking, so I won't go over that again, but I would just add that there's a very strong emotional aspect. There's this visceral hatred of Russia. And, that may be, some cases, it's just sort of left over from the first Cold War. It's just sort of like those embers never died, and they've been fanned, and the flames are burning again, this hatred of Russia. It used to be the Soviet Union, now it's Russia. But then there are other things too. It's actually hard to make sense of it, but it's there. It's not that these people they're not cold calculating people, because their calculations, if you look, I don't think a cold calculating person would make any of these kind of statements. There's a visceral hatred. There's a real, some intense emotions among some of these leaders. And it clouds their judgment. It clouds their ability to really think through, all the consequences of different actions. And so those are the kind of people that we're faced with, and we just have to hope that they're replaced by more rational people in the future.
It's hard to see being just blinded by hatred and rage for so long. I mean, I understand where something happens and there's this very human response of revenge, or justice takes over, but. 4 years, it just seems like it's strong. It's hard to explain. Like, do you think there's a fundamental, just sort of a racism or something in there? Like, I'm just sort of understanding, it's are they framing in a larger, civilizational battle? Because sometimes I think that's what some people like Elon Musk or Trump, when they talk about is Islam or Muslims taking over, this civilizational battle between Christians and Muslims, or the European Caucasians versus the rest. Maybe that's how they frame things in their mind, as some kind of giant race battle.
Right. Well, one thing it's the political scientist Richard Sakwa, I know I've mentioned this before, but maybe it helps to understand what's going on here. He refers to the Ukrainianization of European politics, that you do have that really, unhinged hatred of the Russians in Ukraine. You already had something before the war broke out, before 2014 in Europe. Clearly there was something to work with. There was, Russophobia has been around in a long time in different forms. But it seems like, we have decided, from the very beginning of this conflict in February of 2022, we have allowed we have allowed the Ukrainians to flood our airwaves, to use sort of an old term, but our media with their point of view, then their information, and when you come to the facts, well, it's often just utterly false, as we're seeing in the case of Pokrovsk. There's claims that they're making that, we've basically taken back all of Pokrovsk, and we've taken back all of Kupiansk. This is just absurd. So just the facts are often wrong. And so, but we have allowed this torrent of false facts rather, to flood the media in Europe and in America, and it does affect people's perceptions of what's going on. But more than that, there is this hatred, that has been ginned up. It wasn't always there in Ukraine by a long shot. It was very much a minority thing. Ukraine really was very much integrated both into the Soviet Union. It was a very important part of it. A lot of major industry was there. But then, it's always been very tightly linked and has been a part of Russia in the past, and so many people are Russian speakers there. So there's this hatred of Russia. It was not really natural for all of Ukraine, but there was this core of nationalists, especially in the West, and they have really gained ascendancy, and they have this ideology of kind of the civilizational clash, just like you're saying. It's that the Russians are somehow Asians. They're kind of like the Mongol hordes. And that's often how they refer to them. And, they represent barbarism. And then in the West, we have civilization. And this is something, I think that too, maybe there was some of that tendency already within the West, but it's just this very intense hatred and denigration of all things Russian has come out of Ukraine and has kind of exacerbated all our worst Russophobic tendencies. So, that's another factor that we need to consider.
I just find it odd that, this hatred of the sort of Mongol hordes, Asia coming in, that the West would adopt this line of thinking when the West has all been about, multiculturalism and, we are the melting pot, and, that's what America was. And we basically kind of exported that ideology throughout the West. And to some disastrous consequences. I mean, a lot of it has been due to our wars in the Middle East, leading to all these refugees flooding into European countries and just fundamentally changing the makeup of a lot of these countries and causing a lot of strife. But that's what the West, part of what we were talking about was just like, oh, we're multicultural, we're a melting pot, we accept everybody. And now you're just saying that the ideology is like, no, we have to hate these people. It's a civilizational battle. So it just clashes fundamentally with what the messaging of the West has been for.
Well, and I think you can say that the same is very much true of what's happened in Palestine, over the years, and especially in the last couple of years. It is an obvious, let's say, failure to live up to their own standards. They're often expressed standards. In the case of Russia, again, it was like the very first move of the new coup government in 2014 was to remove protections for the Russian language within the country. And then actually, I think at that time, thanks to some EU pressure, it was reversed, but only temporarily. Later, those were all put in. There's been one move after another to suppress the Russians and to the Russian language in particular, but Russian ethnic identity, to just like remove all traces of Russia from Ukraine. And the thing is, Russia and Ukraine were really one for the longest time. So there's a lot of that. And it's been going on. And I haven't heard a peep of protest from the Europeans about that. You would think that, okay, they're high-minded people, when they show that there are these higher values, and then, okay, Ukraine, you're not living up to them, you need to do this. There's nothing, because they are hypocrites when it comes to this. And it's similar things have happened earlier, even, prior to 2014 in the Baltic states, where protections for the Russian minorities, and there's significant Russian minorities in all of those states, have been removed. Their language is being suppressed, their identity. And there's just nary a peep of protests from the EU. Then it's, I think, even more glaring. The hypocrisy is even more glaringly obvious when you talk about Palestine. But that's what's happening. If you don't, you can have all these ideas on paper, but if you don't live by them, they cease to mean anything. And eventually they just get hollowed out and you become something else.
Yeah, I think it's also very dangerous because I feel like we're entering in this phase now where it seems like we're trying to reject multiculturalism and almost embrace hatred and racism. It almost feels like that in a way. I mean, I see it just on Twitter, when it becomes with the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's just framing it often of just, like I said, the civilizational battle, the Muslim hordes against the Christians, and we gotta fight them off. But the problem is if we start to go down this path and people are feeding this, feeding the airwaves, like you said, of this ideology of the civilizational battle, and that these are bad people, enemy people, and we have to fight them. you and your country, if the battle is between Muslims and Christians, if they want to make it that, or if you want to, they
Yeah.
want to sort of a more of a white supremacist state, then
Right.
the problem is you have brought in so many people from other countries and championed multiculturalism and diversity for so long, and now you're trying to switch tracks, switch gears, and say, well, we got to
Yeah.
hate these people. Well, that can quickly spill over to where people are taking up the sort of like, yeah, this is our country. It's only for white people to do like this, and then now you got a big problem because you live in a diverse country, and you can't just start killing people. You have to work together and build a future together, and so it just feels like it's a bad path that we're moving on. That we're kind of, I feel like the big ship of the West is steering towards that, towards racism, towards like we have to just, because that's where a lot of hatred is founded in. Like if we have to hate Russia, we have to hate the Palestinians and the Muslims, we have to hate the Chinese. Well, then you start to feed that hatred. You have to embrace racism.
Well, yeah, there's always a risk of that. I think, one thing, as many people have pointed out over the years, even the decades, that has always been a contradiction, like within the left in this country, because for the longest time, the left was solidly in support of Israel and Zionism in this country. It's no longer true, which is a very important fact right now. There's been a huge change over the last few years in particular. But for the longest time, it was true. It was just sort of, that was the great majority of leftists in this country were also supportive of Zionism. And those who, saw through it and supported the Palestinians, used this term to describe those people. It was, PEP is Progressive Except Palestine. And so that was always there, and I think you can say the same thing about Russia, the same thing with a lot of, we'll talk about multicultural stuff and whatever, except for Russia. The thing is, you can't really do that. In the end, it comes back to haunt you because it doesn't make any sense. And people see that, you just allow, except we'll hate these people that we really want to hate, or, or we'll allow their dispossession because it's, in this case, it's inconvenient to us that they do occupy these lands. You say, well, yeah, so when it actually push comes to shove, your ideals don't mean anything, right? And I think we can, I don't know exactly what form it's going to take. In the end, who knows? I mean, in the U.S., we have, because we have this character, Trump, in charge of things, who's very kind of vulgar and again, is talks and is not exactly foul mouthed, but he doesn't observe all the liberal pieties, when he talks. And he talked, recently referring to these Somalis as trash and that kind of thing. That does whip up a certain amount, at least within certain segments of the population, potential for real hatred. But then you also see it on the liberal side. And I was just thinking, you can go back to Ukraine, which it may be, if we're looking at Ukraine and the let's say the elite in Ukraine, the ruling elite, we might be looking at the future of Europe. I just, I found myself thinking that. You have, you have the ultranationalists, the ones that are the Banderites. And then there's, I won't get into it today, but there's actually very interesting. Not all ultranationalists are on the same page. They're all in favor of the war and for some sort of, a mono, or maybe not a mono-ethnic, but in one case the interpretation is more racial, and the other is more cultural. We'll just say that for now. But we'll just say they're all ultranationalists, and they're in favor of using violence to achieve their means. Both not just against the Russians, but within the nation of Ukraine. And then you have the liberal nationalists, who actually, when it comes down to policy, they're just really not that different. They kind of speak a different language. And so they talk to the Europeans, and the Europeans talk to them. They feel like they're all one, but they support virtually, all the same policies, or many of the same policies that the violent ultranationalists support. They're really they are together, and they in some cases they often idolize the ultranationalist battalions like Azov and so forth. Now, at the top too, you actually get this accusation from the Banderite soldiers on the ground, that they say that a lot of their leaders, because they spend a lot of time in Kiev, that they become kind of gone soft, and they become sort of, I think there's a lot of cross-pollination. So you get this very extremist anti-Russian, fundamentally, I don't know if racist is the right word, but it is, just a hatred for Russian, not just, the Russian government or the Russian soldiers on the front, but for Russians and Russian culture, everything Russian. You have that, it comes out of the Banderites, but it has risen up to the top, and it's become part of the elite culture. But then you have these people that are very much connected with Europe, and they speak the language of the EU, but they are in the top ranks of all these different groups. They're sort of becoming one. That's what we're observing, and I just wonder if this is something that's going to spread to the rest of Europe. Some of these, obvious inconsistency in their thinking. It's a huge gaping hole in the whole idea of multiculturalism and protection of minority rights and whatever. But it's there, and it's become something very real within Ukraine. It is what the ruling elite is, and
Right.
and they are not. The Europeans are not protecting themselves from that at all. It seems like they're actually allowing themselves to be drawn into it. One thing is that, maybe I'll just put this out there too, is that I think the EU project is, it kind of made a lot of sense on an economic level. I remember how it was often advocated, having a common market or what improves economic efficiency and so on and so forth. And then we have these technocrats, that would be in charge, who would create regulations that just made sense, protected the environment, but also improved economic efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. But the EU doesn't really answer anybody's need for meaning. It doesn't provide anybody with an identity. Nobody thinks like, I'm just a happy subject of the EU. So people become, they kind of get empty, and they don't have a strong sense of their own identity. And I think when that happens, they can become especially vulnerable to these very passionate ideologies. And that's something that they're getting actually from Ukraine. And so, maybe that's what you get with the Chancellor Merz. This is like, okay, yeah, he's supposed to be debating about the budget, but this is something he's drawn into, and he sees, this is the great struggle, and I can see there's good and evil, and I'm on the side of good, and we just have to fight this fight. It gives meaning to his life.
Right. No, I think that's very true. The Europeans, something that, was supposed to be so great about the EU was this collective bargaining power, and it would be, a tide that raises all boats. But the problem is like you said, that they don't have a real identity that binds them. But now they do, and that identity is hatred of Russia. So that's like the one thing that everybody kind of can agree on, that is kind of gluing the Europeans together. Maybe if they didn't have that hatred, they'd all be tearing each other apart. It's like, no, we're all on the same page, right? We just hate Russia, and this is the only thing we all agree on, except for Orban, and maybe we'll get rid of him, and Fico as well. But other than that, we all agree we hate Russia. So they are trying to form the European identity around that. But that's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
That's incredibly destructive. You can't be the source of your of a superpower's purpose, identity, being hatred. That will can only lead into disaster, right?
Yeah. No, it is. It's a very right. I agree. It is a dangerous ideology. So that's one thing. Again, when we look at the actual capacities and willingness to fight and so on, at this point, it just looks like Europe just is incapable of really engaging Russia in World War III. It would be a disaster. But But who knows where Europe is going to be in 5 years? This is the thing is that, we laugh at these people. I find Merz and Starmer and all these people just be ridiculous. And again, they have very low approval ratings, and that should give us hope. Let's just hope it stays that way and they find a replacement. The danger is that they are working hard, again, to scare their people, and they're having some success. You find some polls where, 60% of the people in this country or whatever think that the Russians are going to attack in a few years, which is absurd. But they are constantly bombarded with this kind of news, this false news, and it does have an effect. Maybe they are working to transform their own populations. They're not succeeding so far, and let's hope that they fail. But there is a danger that they will succeed. Again, with the help of false flags and so on and so forth.
Right. I mean, it's also just disappointing to see, going from Schultz to Merz. It's like, if there's another election, can we get somebody different? It just seems like the establishment just produces one type of person. I mean, same thing with the UK. Look, they've had like 10 prime ministers in the past decade, and they've all been garbage. It's just like nobody's really different. I mean, same thing for the U.S. I mean, I'm not one to complain, just about Europe. I mean, we went from Trump, Biden, back to Trump, and so it's, we're not exactly.
No. It seems to be true. It's just in general, it's just that we are not producing, statesmen. We are producing the kind of leaders that we see right now, and there are alternatives. There's the alternative for Germany, the AfD, and which does appear to be something really different, that they have taken that, they have, I think, correctly diagnosed many of Germany's its ills and would present a different policy. But all the other parties are working to keep them down, even though they are the most popular party. Another poll showed that just yesterday. If it comes to it, like it looks like they might actually win an election, I don't think it's beyond these people to declare some sort of martial law or whatever. I mean, it's just that's the way they view the AfD and real opposition in these countries. It's just like, we can't permit this. That's the end of democracy if the most popular party wins. So we'll see. Europe will have an interesting future.
Just going back real quick to something they said about the thing that binds Europe together is this hatred of Russia. Do you think that's true? A large part of what is keeping the EU kind of together collectively is this hatred of Russia. It seems like that's what they care about. They don't want to talk about domestic problems. They get together and they're always just talking about what can we do to stop Russia.
Right. Well, obviously, I think there's a real effort to do that. I mean, that's what they're trying to do. And each of these leaders are trying to scare their own populations. And they're having some success, like I've said. But still, when you look at those low approval ratings, even though people, maybe you'll get large majorities saying, oh, yeah, Russia's very bad, this threat is very serious, they're still much more concerned about getting their social services, their benefits from the government that they're used to getting. And they are unhappy, when the government is actually diverting resources to Ukraine. So at this point, I would just say that, actually, I forgot your question. Sorry.
I was just saying, if the EU, what was I saying? No, I forget it too. Just say if what binds them together is this hatred of Russia.
Yeah,
right?
So it is, the thing is, it seems to be that glue seems to be very, pretty effective within the elite. That's the thing, that they can get together and they can all agree that Russia is terrible, and this is and there's just a couple of bad people out there, Orban and Fico, but the rest of them can all get together and condemn Putin, and that's what, like you say, that's what binds them. And then if you look at the point I was making is that if you look at the common people, the publics of these countries, maybe on paper it looks like they're going along for the most part, not as much as their leaders are, but there isn't any real passion. You can have a huge, overwhelming majority, or a lot of people say, yeah, but it's not something that they're passionately devoted. It doesn't really mean anything. When it comes down to it, they're not interested, as they said, well, they've made clear, we don't want to go to the front. Don't send our sons or our sons and daughters, to Ukraine, and please give us our services. That's still where they are. So it's not really working, within the publics at this point. It's something that's more of an elite phenomenon.
Well, if it's an elite phenomena, then it's something that we can say that kind of binds the EU bureaucracy together,
Mhm.
and NATO to some extent as well. So if when this is all said and done, Russia is going to win. It's going to end somehow, some way, and there's no way that they can sugarcoat it and say that Russia didn't achieve its objectives. Will that just then, if what was binding them together, this bureaucracy and NATO, was this hatred of Russia, will that destroy NATO and the EU? Because I mean, you you can't just be hating them forever, right? I mean, people will get tired of it. They're tired of, we can't just blame Russia for our problems forever. The war is
Right,
over now.
right.
It's
Yeah,
done. And so what do you guys have to show? You failed as your job. You told us all this
yeah,
stuff and
right.
nothing got better for us. And we sacrificed so much of our own money, and our
Hmm.
industry, our economy is completely collapsed, Sean. We
Yeah,
don't have any Russian energy. We're stuck. And now we are on the side of countries like Israel and the United States, which are becoming increasingly unpopular. And now we just have this icky feeling being associated with this side, the
uh-huh.
wrong side, the losing
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, well, I'd hope so. I mean, there's a chance, when I think it was just maybe yesterday that Politico had a headline that said Belgium is now a Russian asset. Because Belgium has put its foot down and said, no, we're not going to steal this money for you. But now there's such a ridiculous headline. You see, the thing is, I see these headlines. I remember seeing them, similar things like during the Russiagate hoax back in the U.S. And they say, like, people have to start seeing through this. It's amazing, though, how long that can go. Clearly, like the Russiagate thing has, to a great extent, fizzled out. It did its damage. I think it affected people's perceptions of Russia, but it's just like there are still a few diehards out there who really believe in the whole thing, but eventually it fizzled out. Um, and I guess we can hope we can see something similar, um,
Is that what you
but
hope
these,
for? The EU to break apart? Do you think that'd be good for Europe? Like, is
yeah,
that
I
could there be a strong bloc like that? I mean, they can have trading agreements. I mean, I guess was the whole
right,
idea of the EU. It's like we're
right. Um,
fragmented, we're weak.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's the EU is presented with a real challenge. I mean, there are these we call them collective action problems. If you get everybody to, if you need to get everybody signed up to do something, it just takes one veto, to weaken your position, or even to completely um, prevent it. So yeah, that's a real challenge. Clearly the EU is becoming increasingly unpopular. Again, I think it was maybe just this morning I saw polls were showing that there's a growing, um, let's say, hostility to the EU and growing support for withdrawal from the EU in places like, especially France and Poland, and a lesser extent in Germany, even though. And again, France and Germany, they are basically the EU. There's still a ways, a good distance from a majority. I think it's like 25% within France wanted to just leave the EU, but that's growing. And so there are, there, yeah, it's a difficult problem. You understand, there's advantages in hanging together, but this at the same time, people are seeing the disadvantage of having this unresponsive technocratic elite, that obviously isn't concerned with the everyday lives of common people. So what do? How do you overcome that collective action problem? Yeah, the EU, maybe, I think it needs to fall apart, but something could replace it. I don't know what that something is. It's difficult to overcome these challenges.
Yeah, it just seems like a big problem with the EU from the basic, the fundamentals of it is that you have unelected bureaucrats. Like there's just no they don't represent what the people actually want. I mean, that's
Right.
obviously a huge problem, right? And it's kind of
Yeah.
ironic that we try to talk about like, oh, we are liberal democracies, and it's like there's nothing democratic about the European Union.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, you have the European Parliament, but those people don't have very much power at all. They have really very little power. You're correct. It's the bureaucrats that have the power, and they often make decisions that are very unpopular in different countries within Europe. And And then those countries are faced with, having to bow down and accept, what the technocrats in Brussels have decided, or maybe defying them, as you find in Hungary. But then they suffer economic consequences. Funds are withheld, fines are imposed, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Do you think that Western civilization is dead?
I think it really has come to an end.
That
Maybe
means
it
dead.
could be, yeah.
Right?
I think so. I don't say that lightly. There are a lot of people who say, "Oh, it was always phony and it was nothing but, subjugation and slavery and, but there were many great things that this Western civilization achieved. I'm a great admirer of those achievements, and I find it sad, that it has reached the point that it has. It's just, I look at England and France, and again, it's not that there weren't crimes associated with in the past with these governments. There were great crimes, but there were also just marvelous achievements. Just there was a reason that the world, looked up to Europe and admired it greatly. But I think it's gone. It has been replaced by these idiots and these technocrats, and the cultures have been hollowed out. Maybe, I just hope that something will replace it, and but it may take a long time. We may be decades or even centuries of dark ages ahead of us. I don't know.
Yeah, I think many people don't ask themselves that question, but I think there's kind of a feeling deep down inside them that they realize there's something wrong. And if Western civilization is dead, then I feel like you can't get people to fight a war for Western civilization, because they're like, what am I fighting for? What are my values anymore? For these guys that are really unpopular, that have seen my country get worse year after year under their rule, and now they're telling me to go fight for what? This dump I'm living in? Get out of here, right?
Yeah. Right. Or even if it isn't a dump, it's just like it's still, even if, let's say, living standards have fallen, and they in general are falling in places like Germany, they're still a lot higher than they are in the rest of the world. But yeah, it's just like they don't believe in it. Nobody's willing to fight and die for this, or very few people. And that's what the polls show. I mean, it's quite stark. It's a very, very small minorities in these countries are saying, yeah, even if we were invaded, I'm not willing to fight. You have majorities saying that. That you wouldn't have found that in the past, but it does tell you something. It does tell you that they think, okay, yeah, I can have a comfortable life. Maybe I just want to hang on to that, but this is not something that really means a whole lot to me. Germany doesn't mean a whole lot. Europe doesn't. France doesn't. It's just a place where I can consume and exist.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of a byproduct of pushing sort of multiculturalism and diversity for so long. You start to lose your own identity in some of these European countries, right? So
I think that's true.
We're all the same, right? We're all European. Who cares? What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be German? What So okay, I have a couple questions. I'll start with this one. So ironically, I feel like we said Western civilization is dead, and we've been the elite sometimes try to frame it maybe in this idea of this battle between Western civilization or the Asian horrors, whatever.
Or authoritarianism.
Yeah, right. Frame it in this sense. But ironically, I feel like Russia might actually end up being the bastion of Western civilization to some extent, because it didn't go the route of the rest of the West, of the collective West. So it has preserved more of its traditional sense. They have a Russian identity. They have nationalism and patriotism that doesn't exist in much of the collective West. They have preserved their ethnic makeup, has been more or less consistent, even though it's very ethnically diverse. It has a majority a Caucasian majority that's kind of stayed this more or less the same, I assume. I'm sure there's been some fluctuations, but do you agree that in that sense that maybe we'll start to people will look at Europe and be like, well, the only few places that are actually like the civilization that survived was actually the Russian one, and that is now the new Western civilization, and we have something new that's in Europe and the United States that needs to do we call it a civilization? It's a work in progress. I mean, what is it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are a lot of people who argue that, and I think that they have, and that their arguments should not be dismissed. You do have people actually moving to Russia because for that reason, they feel like this is the part of European civilization or Christendom that still exists. And they see the future there. And the Russians themselves, it's interesting, like among the leadership in particular, they say that they really love Europe, but that, like we're just saying, but the Europe that they loved doesn't exist anymore. It was a Europe of even like 25 years ago or something. Europe was still Europe, but they feel like it has ceased to be Europe. It has undergone a fundamental change. So this is sort of what we were talking about, but you do hear that kind of this discourse, that it does exist within the elites and beyond the elites, throughout Russia. I guess I do see the chance. I just would say that Russia has a long ways to go. It has made great progress since the 90s. And it is a better place to live all around. I think culturally stronger, safer, more prosperous. It's on the right track, but it still has a long ways to go. And again, I hear a lot about what's going on in Russia from your sister. And clearly she's happy there. That's where she wants to stay. That's where she wants to settle down. And she does believe in the future of Russia. But she says there are a lot of problems. They too deal with high divorce rates and that kind of thing. It's not like it is, they do have it's nominally a Christian country. And there is a large minority of practicing, Orthodox Christians there. But it's a long ways from really being, maybe the civilization that it seeks to be. It does seem to be on that path, but it has a ways to go. So I'm kind of reluctant. I know some people will say that this is a battle between, like, almost between Christendom and atheism, or nihilism probably is a better term to use. And I'm reluctant to say that because I know that it almost seems to I think you have to be a little bit more realistic about where Russia is now. Again, I see the potential for Russia. It is on that path. I don't know that it really has recovered the old Europe, the good parts of Europe, but I think it's on that path, and I think that maybe it's certainly, I think, culturally much healthier than Europe is right now. People do believe in it. They do have faith in their futures. There is a different kind of spirit. There's one thing that I was struck, this is kind of a minor point, but I think it illustrates the greater reality. I was struck by how many new statues there were in Russia. It's just that they are putting up new statues, but to heroes of the past. It's like they continue to celebrate their past. They believe in, where they are, and they include the Soviet Union in that. A lot of the Soviet monuments remain. And I think that was actually wise. That was a shared experience. Not everything about the Soviet Union was bad by a long shot. This was all something. There's something this is all part of who they are, and they don't forget it. And so these new statues go up, and that I think shows. I guess the people that are alive who believe in themselves and believe that they have a future. But in contrast, you see the statues falling down, or being torn down in places like the U.S. and in Europe. And if they're replaced by anything, it's like by maybe a giant clothespin or something. It's not something that really shows a sense of identity. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to that.
Well, what do you think will come out of the West if Western civilization is dead? Does that mean we create a new civilization? We have to become part of another civilization? We absorb, or what does this mean? Do we become the corrupt pedophile civilization? It's like,
yeah. That question is too big for me. I just don't know. I don't think anybody can know. I think it is clear that Western civilization has sort of come to the end of a long, very overall, you have to say, successful run with some horrors in the middle, but there's, I think it has come to an end. I mean, it's just when you look at Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, and Keir Starmer and Chancellor Merz, you say, this is, there's no future in these kind of people. They're not going to lead Europe into a glorious future. They're just overseeing the end of Europe.
What killed it? Well, actually, let me answer that. I kind of feel like I know what killed it, and in some sense, it's just when you say that the Western civilization is dead, I'm not feeling much sadness or remorse, even though I'm a product of it. Maybe I should, but maybe it's because I just am disgusted with what has become. And my concept of Western civilization has been tainted, and in that sense, it's killed it, that people don't care anymore. Maybe it's the apathy that killed it. I don't know if I answered it. I don't like that answer, actually. Give me a better answer.
Again, maybe this question's too big for me. I don't know what killed it, but I have felt real sadness. Maybe it's just because I was born a generation earlier. And I do, like, even in the case of, of course, I grew up, I was really fed, my imagination as a child was fed by European literature, especially British literature, but also by, like so many of the BBC shows, like back in the 1970s, there was still very much a Britain. And it was just, you could, it was these wonderful, silly people, who were very good at poking fun at themselves. But were very proper. Back then you could talk about a British gentleman. Now, there are a lot of people who think that that's still true. It just isn't, that Britain is gone.
There are a few left. There are a few.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. But I do remember it. And as you began to see the fall, I think maybe with Tony Blair, I guess you can always go back farther, but in so many ways it began like the culture started to coarsen, and then began real attacks on the whole notion of Britishness. And they just sort of, like so many of these countries have it's almost like they have autoimmune disorders where their immune systems are attacking themselves. They're going after, so many of these things that made them unique. And it's just sad to see. I remember really feeling sadness when I saw that happening to Britain and to other European countries. But now maybe I'm kind of like you are, just like it's so horrible, just like it's better. It's just they die and get it over with. And then hopefully something that will follow will be better.
I do feel sad when I think about Europe. It's just different with America because it's always been more a diverse thing and a newer thing that it's able to kind of be more malleable in its identity, and I feel like it has in general. But with Europe, it's just a shame because we're talking about thousands of years of civilizations. Your ancestors were here for thousands of years, and they created this, and now it's all gone. It's like, I wouldn't say it's all gone, but it's on its way out. Like you said, it's dying, it's dead. So yeah, in that sense, it is sad. It's just one of those huge questions that I find myself asking, like, what will happen to Europe? And I guess nobody knows. It's just, we know that it's not going to be good. And I hope, when it gets bad, will we see more and more migration? Will the makeups just completely get, will they destroy their histories, tear down more statues? It's just hard to say. It's just. It is a shame. Okay, well, I don't know if we need to continue on this anymore. Is there something else you'd like to talk about before we wrap it up?
Well, maybe we could just mention very quickly what's happening in East Asia. There's not a whole lot to say, but I think we should touch on that because we have in the last couple of episodes. My understanding is that Takaichi, the Japanese prime minister has, she made some sort of attempt to mollify the Chinese. I think she repeated like sort of one of the old formulas from back in the 1970s about, recognizing one China and whatever, just like the Americans do. Technically, we still agree with that there is one China. And then every once in a while, we'll say, oh, yeah, we haven't changed anything. And I think she did the same, but it did not appease the Chinese at all because they can see that it's sort of like they are really changing. There's a de facto rejection of that old understanding. And her comment about defending Taiwan. In other words, militarily intervening if a conflict should break out over Taiwan, clearly is a rejection of that understanding that was reached in the 1970s of a single China. So it hasn't worked. There's still a lot of tension. There was actually a little incident over what in Japanese is called the Senkaku Islands, in Chinese is Diaoyudao or Diaoyutai. And
fishing islands?
Yeah, that's right. That's actually what they mean. Right. They're very small. It's not inhabited. The Japanese have, laid claim to them, say that they're part of their territory. The Chinese say, that's wrong, according to all kinds of documents going back centuries. This has always been a part of China. So just the other day, there was another little kind of conflict erupted there. I think there was, this is what the Japanese say anyway, is that the Chinese Coast Guard tried to chase off a Japanese fishing boat, saying, and then the Japanese Coast Guard came and chased off the Chinese. Now the Chinese have a different version and say that they weren't chased off, so who knows what actually happened. So it shows, there are all these places for, potential flashpoint. But I actually remember that way back in the 1980s when I was in Taiwan, there was an incident back then. It's the same thing, the Diaoyutai. That's when I first learned about it. So this is something that recurs periodically. But the change is that back then, the Kuomintang, the Chiang Kai-shek's party was firmly in control in Taiwan. So they represented Chinese interests, and they tried to chase off the Japanese. But now it's like the new government is firmly in bed with the Japanese, and they support the Japanese and their claims. And of course, this angers the Chinese, including, a lot of Chinese within Taiwan who say, hey, wait a second, they're not even standing up for China, for Chinese interests, and we are Chinese. So anyway, that one incident kind of showed how things have, again, changed in Taiwan and where the fault lines are.
Do you see signs of actual escalation? I mean, once again, it just feels like I see the rhetoric and some of the desire for escalation and this pivot to Asia, but then we just talk about the fundamental weakness. I mean, just the idea. I mean, we started a war on Russia's doorstep. How did that work? You want to start a war off of China's coast? How do you think that's going to work?
Yeah.
It just seems like that. It just seems too insane that it's just like, surely we're not doing that, but it seems like we're just on this track where we just keep on pushing
right.
See what will happen until it blows up, and then we're like, whoops, now we scramble and we can't handle it.
Well, remember there was like that RAND study called Unbalancing Russia or Extending Russia that came out. It's just ways we can weaken Russia. We can keep on poking the Russian bear. We'll poke them this way, but we won't poke them that much so they actually invade. Well, how did that work out? And I think that's probably the same thinking. It's just, we'll keep on poking the Chinese. We'll keep the pressure on them. Well,
I think,
but we just, the assumption is, they wouldn't ever do it. I've heard a lot of people say that, including well-informed people. But I think that's a mistake. I think that, again, this is something that really, really matters to the Chinese. And if either the Taiwanese or the Americans or the Japanese go too far, I think the Chinese could respond in the way that the Russians responded in Ukraine.
Right. We start off this podcast, you mentioned that there is some growing realism within the West. It's some attempts to recognize the reality that, hey, we do live in a different world and that we can't dictate terms like we used to. And I think the reason the U.S. is coming to that conclusion is because we have been trying to use what we thought was overwhelming leverage again and again in situations around the world, and they've all backfired, and none more spectacular than with China and the tariff wars. But now I'm just wondering, I feel like we've exhausted all of our leverage. What leverage does the United States have left? I feel like the biggest piece of leverage that I think we had that we have exhausted was the dollars, the reserve currency status. If you want to do business, global business, you have to use the dollar. But now, thanks to a lot of our actions and the long work by BRICS, we have countries like Russia, China, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, settling accounts in currencies not denominated in USD. They are doing direct cross-border transactions, huge amounts of volume, and they're just circumventing the U.S. system. I think that was the largest piece of leverage. And then, military leverage, it seems like that's the only thing we have left. But, finding out we don't have that is scary. But we have kind of found out we don't have the military leverage, right? Through Ukraine, through the Houthis, through Israel, Iran.
Right.
What leverage do we have?
Yeah, well, we hope so. I think there are realists within the Pentagon, and I think within different defense departments throughout the West. But there are also the uber hawks, the people who really do want to go to war and just refuse to recognize their own weaknesses. And one example that recently there was a RAND paper. I mentioned the RAND Corporation again, very, very close, I think tank, very closely connected with the U.S. military security complex. They very recently presented or put forward a paper called Stabilizing China. So this was like the opposite of the RAND Corporation paper that urged us to actually provoke Russia up to a point. But it was very realistic to say basically, hey, let's admit it, that we can't wage a war against China right off its own coast, and so we need to learn to live with China. It was a very welcome dose of realism, and it caused a certain amount of optimism, among dissident circles. But then that was withdrawn. So it shows that there are realists. Somebody wrote that paper. That's good. But it was withdrawn. So it shows that we still have the China hawks that just don't want to see this and you would think that they would just say, accept the facts and say, well, we had a good run. This 1945 all the way, we're talking about 80 years basically, where we could just have our way. But I don't see why it's so hard, or why it should even be humiliating to say that, hey, the world's changed and it always was going to, and now it's time to pull back. But clearly, there are a lot of people who can't do that. It's become, again, a part of their identity as being, the hegemon. And those people, unfortunately, occupy positions of power in defense departments and, throughout governments in the West.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just frustrating having these discussions and providing commentary when one side lives in an alternate reality, and I keep on asking, like, why, what's going on? And it's just like, well, they just live in La La Land. I'm like, well,
yeah.
How long can they live in La La Land, right? They got to get out of there at some point.
You would think so.
Okay, well, let's hope they do. Okay, well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Sure.
Unless there's anything else you want to...
No, I think we can. That's a good place to end it.
Okay, well, tomorrow we will do members-only videos, so if anybody made it to the end, if you want to become a subscriber, it's $3 a month. It would mean a lot. And yeah, my dad and I, we have a little more personal discussions that I think you guys could find interesting. So if you want to become a subscriber, click the join button below on the YouTube thing. Okay, all right, thanks a bunch. Have a good rest of your day, Dad, and a great weekend, everybody.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.